Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Crop. I'm Anna Heslop, and today we're having a bit of a swap around, and I'll be chatting with Alison Stewart about some work that FAR has been doing around identifying and promoting the value of the arable industry in New Zealand. Welcome, Alison.
Welcome.
First of all, promotion work isn't really what FAR usually does. It's a bit of a departure from research and extension. So how did this come about?
Well, I guess, FAR has always been a great proponent of the arable industry, but we've always been very careful to sort of stay in the research, development and extension sort of box. But I think that there's so much focus now within New Zealand on how our agricultural industries are operating, consumers, politicians, the local councils, they're all sort of developing opinions, perceptions, policies around how we grow crops and animals in New Zealand. And I guess a lot of people don't really know what arable is. It's not a word that, if you asked a dinner party, sort of like, do you know what arable is, that people would immediately be able to explain. And so we just felt that, along with the Federated Farmers Arable section, that we really needed to just raise the general awareness of the arable industry in New Zealand. And for a whole range of reasons, political policy sort of reasons, public awareness about the value of our industry, just so that when people are thinking about agriculture, they understand, the role that arable croppers actually have in New Zealand.
So you would have done a little bit of research into this and asked some questions. What have you learned about what people do know, and probably more importantly, what they don't know?
Well, interestingly, they know very little, or the little that they know is often, misperception. Like they have misperceptions about arable. So I think most people know that it's grains, cereals, wheat, barley, oats. They wouldn't necessarily know that the arable industry also includes the production of a lot of seed crops, particularly, herbage seed and, hybrid vegetable seed. And so they probably don't realise that arable growers are growing all the seed that's needed for the livestock sectors to produce their pastures. And so, arable is a really, really important component of, the livestock industry as much as it is of the plant-based industries.
So there'd be no pastoral industry without arable.
Well, exactly. And I don't think that arable growers get recognition for the contribution that they're making to, underpinning New Zealand agriculture. And I think that the general public, even though they might know that we grow grains, they don't necessarily have a full understanding of the whole, farm to plate supply chain. Because it's an ingredient, you don't get the same direct line of sight. If you go into a supermarket and you buy an apple or you buy an avocado, as opposed to, buying bread or flour or, baked produce, you wouldn't necessarily immediately feel a direct line of contact with a grain grower in Canterbury.
But having said that, even if they did know that, they may falsely, in most cases, assume that the bread they're buying includes New Zealand grain.
Oh, absolutely. And this is, I guess, one of the things that, the arable industry has been trying to do over the last couple of years is raise awareness of what grain goes into bread that, that New Zealand consumers buy in the supermarket. And we did a consumer survey through the Agricultural Economic research unit at Lincoln University, they did a consumer survey for us, and they were asking, consumers what they knew about the bread that they bought in their supermarket. And the vast majority of them assumed that the bread that they bought had been produced from flour made from New Zealand grain.
Which is actually a reasonable assumption when you drive along the road, particularly in the South Island, and you see fields of wheat. And if you know that wheat makes flour, makes bread, why wouldn't you think that?
Yes. And to be fair, in the South Island, a lot of the bread that you buy in the supermarket probably does come from New Zealand grain, just because of the closeness of the grain to, the mills and the main bakers. But in the North Island, where, there's a lot less wheat and being grown, the vast majority of the bread, for example, in Auckland, would be bread that had been made from flour that had come from Australian grain. And I would imagine that the vast majority of consumers don't know that. And what we're trying to do is educate the consumer to understand, where their bread comes from. And I suppose try and get them to, particularly in the sort of the COVID environment, where we want people to sort of support local growers and make sure that our economy keeps ticking along. We want them to proactively look for bread that's been made from New Zealand grain.
Is that easy for them? Is it easy for them to find that?
Well, it is if you buy from a local artisan baker, then often they will advertise, that this was made from local grain. But if you go into a supermarket, very few of the brands will tell you where the flour has come from. And so it would be very difficult to know whether it was from New Zealand grain or not. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the bakers and the retailers to promote, products that have been made from 100% New Zealand grain, or even includes New Zealand grain, because often what they do is they'll blend, Australian grain with New Zealand grain. And so it might be a mixture, but it would be nice for the consumer to be able to go into a supermarket and say, I would like to be able to get some bread that's been made from New Zealand grain because I would like to support New Zealand growers.
And how is there any way they can find out, is FAR able to help them find out where they can get that New Zealand grown product?
Well, one of the initiatives that we're doing, as part of this wider promotional thing around New Zealand wheat, is that we are collecting information on all of the bakers and stores that sell bread and baked produce that's made from New Zealand grain. And ultimately, what we'd really like to do is to create a phone app so that somebody could say, okay, I live in, South Auckland, and they would put in their, address, and immediately what would come up would be a list of local bakers that grow, that have got bread that's been made from New Zealand grain. Now, that's a big piece of work, but it's the starting point to just trying to provide information to consumers so that they can choose that if they would like to support local growers and they would like their bread to be made from New Zealand grain, then they've got information available that will tell them where to go.
So, and what other facts and figures and information have you been finding about the arable industry? I guess there's every other industry, agricultural and otherwise, seems to be able to tell the world how much they produce, how much it's worth, how many jobs they've got. Do we know that about arable now?
We're slowly gathering a lot of information. I mean, it's all out there, but it's never been pulled together in sort of resource material that can be easily, distributed in a form that is interesting, to the general public. So as part of our promotional campaign, we've been developing little fact sheets, and they tend to be for government agencies, regional councils, other sectors, and it will just say, sort of what the economic value of the industry is, what crops we grow, what our environmental footprint is, sort of so that people can look to see what Arable as a land use option, how it stacks up against, sort of dairy and beef and lamb and horticulture, etc. on all those criteria. That's probably not the collateral that you would put out to the general public, but we're basically just collecting information in different forms so that we can just try to get people to understand more about what Arable is.
And so you're talking about the differences between communicating that information to the public, to the consumer, to policymakers. There was a trip. You hosted a group from Wellington last year.
Yeah. So that was, it was a really valuable trip because we know that when we have engaged with government agencies, whether it's MPI or AIMB or the EPA or the Climate Change Commission and all of those different groups, we know that they have limited understanding of the diversity of what an arable system is. And so we hosted them for a day touring around Canterbury. We had about, 35 various government officials. And we basically took them to 3 arable farms, and all relatively close to each other, but all quite different in, sort of the focus of the crops or the integration of livestock, the diversity of the rotations. And it was really interesting to see the responses that we got, which was very much around, I guess, a surprising sudden awareness of how incredibly diverse and complex arable farming systems are. And I think that that's the really important message we wanted to get out, is that, it's not one size fits all, that in different regions, and even within the same region, arable farms can be quite different. And when you develop policies to implement, sort of at a regional level, you have to be very careful about making judgments and thinking that because that policy can be met by one group of arable growers in one region, that it's going to be easily met by another group because their systems are so different.
And did they understand that? Do you think they got that message?
I think so. But of course, that was only 30 people. We've got to get that message out much more widely. And so we want to have, similar, sort of farm visits this year. I guess, FAR needs to get a lot of that information out in a number of different communication sort of channels so that a wider range of people understand. Particularly when you're getting into the whole environmental compliance area, which all the agricultural sectors in New Zealand are having to address, the government's climate change targets, their essential freshwater targets.
There's a lot of policy coming down the line, isn't there?
Yes, and it can seem overwhelming. And, at the moment, we're in one of those situations where we know that there's a whole load of policies coming down, but we don't necessarily know the details of them and how they're going to be implemented. And so it's hard for us to give, really accurate 100%, guidance to growers about what they have to do. We basically just have to get them to understand what the big ticket items are, that irrespective of what minor rules and regulations there are in different regions, if they implement this good management practice, it's going to make a difference. And so there's a big program of work that we're doing, around environmental compliance and getting the message out to growers about farm environment plans. But it comes again back to the message that we want to get out there around the environmental footprint of Arable, and how Arable can integrate really nicely with livestock to give a win-win for both types of farming systems. And the 1980s in in Canterbury was, mixed cropping livestock. And that's a really resilient farm system that can be economically viable and have a good environmental footprint. The question is, how can we bring some of those values and benefits of mixed cropping livestock back into a system that won't undermine the profitability of, for example, say, a beef and sheep farmer or a dairy farmer? How can we get the best of both plants and animals?
So that's part of this profile work, getting those messages out as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, people make assumptions about, fertilizer use in arable cropping. And I've seen lots of things written about, if you convert from dairy to arable cropping, then you're likely to have more nitrate leaching. And I mean, we have no evidence whatsoever that says that that's the case. Now, we need to be able to get good data out there that, that shows that if you're an arable farmer and you're growing a wheat crop, yes, you might put 150, 200 kgs of nitrogen on your crop, but all of it's being taken up and being used by the crop for growth, and therefore the risk of nitrate leaching is relatively low. So it all comes back to base management practice. We just need to make policy makers aware of the fact that having numbers as targets doesn't work when you're dealing with a biological system. It's the outcome that you're trying to achieve that's the important thing.
So if you had one message, there was a whole bunch of very important environmental policymakers in the room right now, what would your message be to them?
I think it would be to understand more about the whole farm system and understand that there are many, many farms in New Zealand that are diverse and that include both crops and livestock. And you have to understand that imposing, a target on one component of the farm might improve that component, but it might ultimately create a perverse outcome in the other part of the farm. So you really have to understand whole farm systems in order to be able to develop policy that's going to make a difference, the difference that we want.
Well, thank you very much. I hope the profile work continues to go well. Everybody listening today, have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.